The first thing anyone noticed about Martin Cleary when he walked into the ranger station at Hetch Hetchy on October 19, 1907, was that he was alone. The second thing they noticed was that he would not explain why. Cleary had departed from the same station 11 days earlier with 4 other men: Thomas Haverford, a geologist from the University of California; Samuel Pruitt, a surveyor contracted by the city of San Francisco; James Littleton, Pruitt's assistant; and David Chen, a camp cook and packer who had worked the Sierra Nevada routes for nearly 2 decades. They had gone to map a section of the Tuolumne River canyon that would soon be submerged if the proposed dam went forward. It was not supposed to be dangerous work. The weather had been clear. All 5 men were experienced in the backcountry. When Cleary returned, he was carrying only his bedroll and canteen. His boots were nearly destroyed. His hands were wrapped in torn cloth that had once been part of his shirt. He had lost perhaps 20 pounds. The ranger on duty, a man named Howard Vickers, wrote in his log that Cleary's eyes did not seem to focus on anything in the room, but somewhere past it. Vickers asked where the others were. Cleary said he did not know. This was the first lie, though no one called it that. Not then. Vickers asked what had happened. Cleary said there had been an accident. Vickers asked what kind of accident. Cleary closed his eyes and did not answer. A search party of 9 men was dispatched within the hour. They found the expedition's base camp on the 3rd day, intact but abandoned. Supplies were neatly stacked. Bedrolls remained. The skillet still hung from a tree branch. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage from weather or animal. It looked as though the men had simply stood up and walked away. The searchers found Thomas Haverford's body 6 miles north of the camp, at the base of a granite face that should not have been climbed without ropes. His neck was broken. His journal, which he had kept faithfully, ended mid-sentence on October 14th. The light here at dawn is unlike any. They found Samuel Pruitt and James Littleton together 4 days later, in a shallow ravine 11 miles to the east. Both had drowned, though the creek running through the ravine was less than 2 feet deep. Littleton's hand was locked around Pruitt's wrist. The coroner would later note that Littleton appeared to have died first. David Chen was never found. By the time the search was called off in early November, the only living witness to whatever had occurred in the Tuolumne backcountry was Martin Cleary, and Martin Cleary would not speak. He answered direct questions with the smallest possible truths. Yes, they had all been together on the morning of October 14th. No, he could not say why they had separated. No, he had not seen Haverford fall. No, he did not know how Pruitt and Littleton had ended up in the water. Yes, he had tried to find them. No, he could not explain the route he had taken back to the station. When pressed, he became silent. When threatened with legal consequences, he became silent. When James Littleton's widow came to his boarding house in Oakland and begged him to tell her anything at all about her husband's final days, Cleary stood in the doorway and said, "I'm sorry," and closed the door. The phrase, "I'm sorry," would become, over the years, the only consistently repeated element of his testimony. He said it to the county investigator. He said it to the families. He said it to the reporter from the San Francisco Call who tracked him down in 1909. He said it in 1913 when Thomas Haverford's brother hired a private attorney to compel his testimony in a civil proceeding. He said it in 1919 when Samuel Pruitt's daughter wrote to him on the occasion of her wedding, asking only that he tell her whether her father had suffered. He said it, and then he said nothing else. The historian who would later compile the fragmentary record of the Tuolumne incident, a woman named Dr. Evelyn Marsh, working in 1981 from the archives of the Bancroft Library, noted that Cleary's silence had a quality she described as structural. It was not evasive. It was not hostile. It was not the silence of a man protecting himself from blame. It was, she wrote, the silence of a man who had decided, with great deliberation, that certain things were better left unsaid. Cleary lived another 42 years after his return. He worked as a freight clerk, then as a bookkeeper, then in his final decades as a part-time handyman. He never married. He attended church irregularly. He kept no journal, wrote no letters that survived, and gave no interviews. Those who knew him in later life described him as courteous, reliable, and profoundly alone. He did not drink. He did not argue. He was seen occasionally staring at the hills east of the bay with an expression that his landlady, in a letter to her sister, called the look of a man who has forgotten how to be forgiven. When Martin Cleary died in 1949, his effects included 3 books, a spare set of clothes, a savings account with $114, and a single photograph of the 5 men taken the morning they departed for the Tuolumne. The photograph was found in his coat pocket. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn through in places, separating the image into pieces. On the back, in pencil, someone had written, October 8, 1907. God keep us. The handwriting was not Cleary's. Martin Cleary was 31 years old in the autumn of 1907. He had been born in Sacramento to Irish immigrant parents, both of whom had died of influenza before he turned 15. He had worked his way through odd jobs, mill hand, stable assistant, railroad porter, before finding steadier employment with the U.S. Geological Survey as a field assistant. It was not prestigious work, but it was work that took him into open country, and those who knew him said he preferred the silence of the Sierra to the noise of the city. He was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was literate and observant. He kept his own counsel. He had a reputation for being dependable in difficult terrain. This was why Thomas Haverford had requested him for the Tuolumne expedition. Haverford was 43, a professor of geology at Berkeley, a man of moderate renown in his field. He had published papers on the glacial history of the Sierra and had been consulted by the city of San Francisco during the early debates over the Hetch Hetchy Dam. He was known to be meticulous, cautious, and somewhat humorless. His colleagues described him as a man who treated fieldwork with the gravity of surgery. Samuel Pruitt was 37, a contract surveyor who had worked on water projects across California. He was louder than Haverford, more sociable, and more willing to bend procedure if it saved time. He had a wife and 2 daughters in San Jose. He sent them letters from every assignment. His assistant, James Littleton, was 24 and newly married. Littleton had been a surveyor for only 2 years, but Pruitt spoke well of his discipline and his eye for elevation. Littleton's wife, Margaret, would later say that her husband had been nervous about the trip, not because of the terrain, but because he worried about being away from her. David Chen was 51. He had been born in Guangdong and had come to California as a boy. He had worked in the mines, on the railroads, and eventually in the high camps of the Sierra as a cook and packer. He spoke 3 languages and was regarded by those who employed him as indispensable. He knew the mountains better than any of them. These 5 men had not known each other well before October 1907, but the record suggests they had come to a functional respect. Howard Vickers, the ranger, noted in his log that the group had seemed in good spirits when they departed. There had been no quarrels, no tension. Haverford had joked about the weight of his rock samples. Pruitt had complained about the quality of the tobacco he'd brought. Chen had pointed out a pair of hawks circling above the valley and said it was a good omen. Cleary, according to Vickers, had said very little, but he had smiled when Chen made the comment about the hawks. Dr. Marsh, in her reconstruction, placed significant weight on the testimony of a woman named Rose Tillman, who had run a boarding house in Groveland, the last town the men passed through before entering the backcountry. Tillman recalled the group stopping for a meal on the afternoon of October 7th. She remembered Haverford because he had asked for a glass of milk instead of coffee, which she found unusual for a grown man. She remembered Littleton because he had written a letter to his wife at her table and asked if she could post it for him. She remembered Pruitt because he had tipped her generously. She remembered Cleary because he had been the last to leave and because he had paused at the door and looked back at the others as though he were trying to fix the moment in his mind. I thought it was odd at the time, Tillman told an interviewer in 1938. But you see men do strange things before they go into the mountains. Some of them are superstitious. Some of them just want to remember things while they still can. When asked if Cleary had seemed worried, Tillman said no. When asked if any of the men had seemed worried, she said no. When asked if she had any sense that something was wrong, she paused and then said, I think he knew he might not see them again, but I don't think he knew why. The expedition had been planned for 2 weeks. They were to establish a base camp near the confluence of 2 creeks, map a 12-mile section of the canyon, and return by October 20th. The weather forecast was stable. The terrain was difficult, but not extreme. Haverford had done similar work in the area before. Chen knew the routes. There was no reason to expect disaster. And yet in the archives, Dr. Marsh found a letter written by Haverford to his department head on October 3rd, 5 days before departure. In it, Haverford mentioned that he had revised the route slightly to avoid a section of canyon that had been affected by a rock slide earlier in the year. He noted that this would add a day to the expedition, but would keep them on safer ground. The revised route would take them farther from established trails. It is not clear whether Haverford discussed this change with the others. It is not clear whether Cleary knew. The last confirmed sighting of all 5 men together was on the morning of October 14, 1907. This is established through 2 sources: Cleary's own testimony, which he gave in fragments over several months, and the evidence recovered from the base camp. According to Cleary, the group had risen at dawn. The weather was cold but clear. They had eaten a breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, prepared by Chen. Haverford had reviewed the day's objectives. They were to continue mapping the eastern rim of the canyon, a task that required splitting into 2 groups. Haverford and Chen would take the higher elevations. Pruitt, Littleton and Cleary would work the lower sections near the water. This division of labor was, according to Cleary, unremarkable. It had been done before on previous days. Cleary stated that they separated sometime around 8 in the morning. He recalled that the last thing Haverford said to him was a reminder to mark their positions carefully, as the canyon's proportions could be deceptive. He recalled that Chen had waved as he and Haverford started up the slope. He did not recall what Pruitt or Littleton had said. When asked why he did not recall, Cleary said, "I wasn't paying attention." When pressed, he said, "I should have been." The search party found Haverford's journal in his pack at the base camp. The final entry, dated October 14th, reads, "Morning clear. Split the group as planned. Chen and I will take the ridgeline north of the second creek. Pruitt's team to follow the water. Cleary seems tired but capable. The light here at dawn is unlike any—" The sentence ends there. The pen had not run out of ink. The page had not been torn. Haverford had simply stopped writing. Dr. Marsh noted that this was consistent with Haverford's other journal entries. He often wrote in fragments, returning to them later in the day. The abrupt ending was not, in itself, unusual. What was unusual was that Haverford never returned to the camp to finish it. Cleary's account of the hours that followed is the only account, and it is spare. He stated that he, Pruitt, and Littleton worked their way downstream for approximately 2 hours, taking measurements and making notes. He stated that Pruitt was in good spirits. He stated that Littleton was quiet, but not unusually so. He stated that sometime around midday, Pruitt suggested they split again. Pruitt and Littleton would continue along the main channel, while Cleary would check a tributary that branched to the south. This, Cleary said, was a reasonable division. The tributary was short and shallow. He would be gone no more than an hour. He stated that he agreed. He stated that he walked south along the tributary, took his measurements, and returned to the main channel. He stated that Pruitt and Littleton were not there. When asked how long he waited, Cleary said he did not know. When asked what he did next, Cleary said he searched. When asked where he searched, Cleary became silent. The problem, as Dr. Marsh would note, is that Cleary's route back to the ranger station did not align with any logical search pattern. The distance between the base camp and the station was roughly 23 miles, most of it along established trails. Cleary had taken 11 days to cover it. Even accounting for injury or exhaustion, this suggested he had not walked in a straight line. The search party had found Cleary's boot prints in several locations that made no geographic sense. He had climbed at least one ridge that led nowhere. He had descended into a drainage that dead-ended in a cliff. He had circled back on himself more than once. It was as though he had been looking for something, or trying to avoid something. When asked directly whether he had encountered Haverford, Pruitt, Littleton, or Chen after the separation, Cleary said, "No." When asked if he had seen any evidence of them, Cleary said, "No." When asked if he had heard anything, shouts, gunfire, rockfall, Cleary said, "No." When asked why he had not returned to the base camp, Cleary said, "I tried." When asked why it had taken 11 days, Cleary said, "I got lost." When asked how an experienced field assistant could get lost on terrain he had been mapping for a week, Cleary said, "I don't know." And then he stopped answering. The bodies, when they were found, raised more questions than they resolved. Thomas Haverford had fallen, or climbed, a granite face 6 miles north of the base camp. The face was nearly vertical. There were no ropes in his pack, no pitons, no equipment that would suggest an intentional ascent. The coroner's report noted that his injuries were consistent with a fall from height, but it also noted that his hands were abraded in a way that suggested he had gripped the rock for some time before falling. He had been trying to climb. The question was why. Samuel Pruitt and James Littleton had drowned in a creek that was, at its deepest, 22 inches. Both men were fully clothed. Neither showed signs of struggle. Littleton's hand was locked around Pruitt's wrist with such force that the searchers had to pry the fingers apart. The coroner suggested that Littleton might have been trying to pull Pruitt out of the water, but Pruitt had drowned first. The sequence made no sense. Dr. Marsh would later consult with a wilderness medicine expert, who proposed that both men might have suffered from hypothermia, severe enough to cause confusion and loss of motor control. But the weather records for October 14th through 18th showed no freezing temperatures. The days had been cool but not cold. The expert also noted that hypothermia did not explain why 2 men would lie down in a shallow creek and remain there until they drowned. David Chen was never found. The search covered a radius of 15 miles from the base camp. Bloodhounds were brought in. They lost his scent near a rockfall on the canyon's western slope. One of the searchers, a man named Peter Alvarez, told the Stockton Record in 1908 that he believed Chen had walked off the edge of the earth. When pressed, Alvarez clarified, "I mean, he went somewhere we couldn't follow, or he didn't want to be found." When asked if he thought Chen was still alive, Alvarez said, "No." When asked why not, Alvarez said, "Because if he was alive, he would have come back. Chen wasn't the kind of man to run." The question that haunted the investigation, and would haunt Dr. Marsh 70 years later, was this: what had caused 5 experienced men to abandon their camp, scatter across miles of wilderness, and die in ways that defied logic? And why had Martin Cleary survived, and why would he not say? The pressure on Martin Cleary began within days of his return and did not relent for years. The county investigator, a man named Douglas Fenton, interviewed Cleary 4 times in October and November of 1907. Fenton's notes, preserved in the Tuolumne County archives, describe Cleary as cooperative in manner but evasive in substance. Fenton wrote that Cleary answered every question but volunteered nothing. He did not elaborate. He did not speculate. He did not offer theories. When Fenton asked if Cleary believed the others were dead, Cleary said, "Yes." When Fenton asked how he knew, Cleary said, "I don't." When Fenton pointed out the contradiction, Cleary said, "I just know." Fenton wrote, "Subject displays no visible guilt but also no grief. Affect is flat. He does not meet the eye. I do not believe he is lying, but I do believe he is withholding." The families pressed harder. Thomas Haverford's brother, a banker in San Francisco, demanded a formal inquest. The inquest was convened in December 1907. Cleary testified for 40 minutes. The transcript shows that he repeated, almost verbatim, the same account he had given to Vickers, Fenton, and the search party. When the coroner asked if he had any additional information that might explain the deaths, Cleary said, "No." When Haverford's brother stood and shouted, "You were there. You must know something," Cleary looked at him and said, "I'm sorry." The inquest returned a verdict of accidental death for all 4 men. No charges were filed. Cleary was free to go. But he was not free. Margaret Littleton, James Littleton's widow, wrote to Cleary in January 1908. The letter was never answered, but a copy survived in her papers, donated to the California Historical Society in 1963. She wrote, Mr. Cleary, I do not write to accuse you. I write because I cannot sleep. My husband wrote to me every day we were apart, and now I have only silence. If you can tell me anything, if he said anything, if he seemed afraid, if you saw him at the end, I would be grateful. I would not ask you to say more than you are able. I only ask that you give me something to hold." Cleary did not reply. She wrote again in March. Again no reply. In May she traveled to Oakland and went to his boarding house. The landlady told her that Cleary had moved. She did not know where. Margaret Littleton spent the rest of her life believing her husband had suffered. She remarried in 1912 but kept Littleton's name. She died in 1954. In her will, she left a small sum of money to the Sierra Club with the stipulation that it be used to improve trail markers in the Hetch Hetchy region so that no one else should be lost. The San Francisco Call ran a feature on the Tuolumne incident in March 1909 under the headline, "The Man Who Came Back Alone." The reporter, a woman named Harriet Voss, tracked Cleary to a rooming house in Alameda. She knocked on his door and asked for an interview. Cleary opened the door but did not invite her in. Voss asked if he would tell her what happened in the canyon. Cleary said, no. Voss asked if he would at least confirm the basic facts. The separation, the search, the route back. Cleary said, "I've already told the authorities everything I know." Voss asked if that was true. Cleary was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." Voss wrote in her article, "He said yes, but his eyes said no. I do not think Martin Cleary is a liar. I think he is a man who has chosen not to tell the truth, and I think that choice is costing him everything." The article ran with a photograph of Cleary standing in the doorway. He is thin, unsmiling, his hands in his pockets. He looks older than 32. He looks like a man who has not slept well in a long time. Voss ended the article with a question. What does a man owe to the dead, and what does he owe to himself? In 1913, Thomas Haverford's brother filed a civil suit against Cleary, alleging negligence and wrongful death. The suit claimed that Cleary had failed in his duty to assist the others, that he had abandoned them, and that his silence constituted an obstruction of justice. The case was heard in San Francisco Superior Court. Cleary was represented by a court-appointed attorney, a young man named Peter Callahan, who had little experience in such matters. The trial lasted 3 days. Callahan's defense was simple. There was no evidence that Cleary had caused the deaths, and no evidence that he could have prevented them. The separation had been agreed upon. The terrain was dangerous. Men died in the mountains. Silence was not a crime. The plaintiff's attorney argued that Cleary's silence was, in fact, evidence of guilt. "A man who has nothing to hide does not hide," he said. "A man who has done nothing wrong does not refuse to speak." Cleary took the stand on the 3rd day. He was asked again to describe the events of October 14th. He did. He was asked if he had seen the others after the separation. He said no. He was asked if he had any reason to believe they were in danger. He said no. He was asked if he had done anything to cause their deaths. He said no. Then the plaintiff's attorney asked, "Mr. Cleary, do you feel any responsibility for what happened to those men?" Cleary was silent. The attorney repeated the question. Cleary said, "Yes." The courtroom went still. The attorney asked, "Can you explain why?" Cleary said, "No." The attorney asked, "Will you explain why?" Cleary said, "No." The judge intervened. He asked Cleary if he understood that his refusal to answer could be interpreted as an admission of guilt. Cleary said, "Yes." The judge asked if he wished to reconsider. Cleary said, "No." The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They returned a verdict in favor of the defendant. There was no evidence of wrongdoing. But as the foreman read the verdict, he looked at Cleary and said, "We find no fault in law, but we cannot say the same in conscience." Cleary moved frequently in the years that followed. He worked in Sacramento, in Stockton, in Fresno, in small towns whose names appear only briefly in census records and city directories. He did not stay anywhere long. Those who employed him said he was competent, punctual, and withdrawn. He did not make friends. In 1919, Samuel Pruitt's daughter, Helen, wrote to him. She had just turned 18. She was about to be married. She had never known her father. She had been only 6 when he died, and she wanted to know something about him. Anything. She wrote, "Did he speak of us? Did he seem happy? Was he afraid?" Cleary did not respond. Helen wrote again. She wrote, "I don't need the truth. I just need something." Cleary sent a single reply. It was brief. It read, "Your father was a good man. I am sorry I cannot tell you more." Helen kept the letter for the rest of her life. When she died in 1987, it was found among her papers, along with a note she had written to herself. "This is all I have. It is not enough." In 1929, a ranger named Carl Dietrich was conducting a survey in the Hetch Hetchy region when he came across an old base camp. It was overgrown, long abandoned, but he recognized it from the reports. He found a rusted skillet, a collapsed tent, and a small cairn of stones that had not been there in the original search. Inside the cairn, wrapped in oilcloth, was a notebook. The notebook belonged to David Chen. It contained entries in Chinese, English, and a third script Dietrich could not identify. The entries were dated from October 8th to October 15th, 1907. Dietrich brought the notebook to a translator at the University of California. The translation was incomplete. Many of the pages were water damaged, but the final legible entry, dated October 15th, read, "The others are gone. I do not know where. I saw M. this morning on the ridge. He did not come down. I think he knows. I think he has always known. If I do not return, do not blame him. He is trying to carry what none of us could." Dietrich tried to locate Martin Cleary to show him the notebook. He learned that Cleary had moved to Oakland and was working as a handyman. Dietrich drove to Oakland and found Cleary's address. When Cleary answered the door, Dietrich explained who he was and what he had found. He asked if Cleary would be willing to read Chen's notebook. Cleary looked at the oilcloth package for a long time. Then he said, "No." Dietrich asked if he was sure. Cleary said, "I'm sure." Dietrich asked if there was anything he wanted to say. Cleary said, "No." Dietrich left the notebook with the university. It remains there in the archives, untranslated in full. Martin Cleary died on March 4, 1949, in a charity ward at Oakland City Hospital. He was 73 years old. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though the attending nurse noted that he had been in decline for some time. He had no visitors. He left no will. His effects were minimal. The photograph of the 5 men found in his coat pocket was turned over to the hospital administrator, who did not know what to do with it. It eventually made its way to the Bancroft Library, where it was filed under Unidentified Historical Photographs, California, early 20th century. It remained there until 1981, when Dr. Evelyn Marsh began her research. Dr. Marsh spent 3 years reconstructing the Tuolumne incident. She interviewed descendants of the 5 men. She reviewed coroner's reports, search logs, court transcripts, newspaper archives, and personal correspondence. She hiked the terrain herself, though much of it had been altered by the construction of the dam. She consulted geologists, wilderness survival experts, psychologists, and historians of trauma. She could not determine what had happened in the canyon, but she reached a conclusion about Martin Cleary's silence. In the final chapter of her monograph, What the Mountains Keep, the Tuolumne Incident, and the Architecture of Silence, Marsh wrote, "It is tempting to interpret Cleary's refusal to speak as guilt, fear, or even cruelty. But the record does not support this. Cleary did not flee. He did not resist questioning. He did not profit from silence. He endured decades of suspicion, isolation, and grief without defending himself. I believe Cleary's silence was protective, not of himself, but of others. I believe he knew something about the final hours of those men that he judged too terrible to share, not because it would incriminate him, but because it would wound the families beyond repair. There are truths that do not heal. There are answers that do not comfort. Cleary understood this, and so he carried the weight alone." Marsh noted that this interpretation was speculative. She acknowledged that she could be wrong, but she pointed to a pattern in Cleary's behavior. He did not deny responsibility. but he also did not claim it. He did not lie, but he also did not tell the whole truth. He apologized, but he did not explain. This, Marsh wrote, is not the behavior of a man hiding a crime. It is the behavior of a man hiding a mercy. In 1985, Marsh gave a lecture at Berkeley on the subject of historical silence. During the question and answer session, a graduate student asked if she believed Cleary had made the right choice. Marsh was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't think there was a right choice. I think there was only the choice he could live with." The student pressed, "But don't the families deserve the truth?" Marsh said, "They deserved many things. They deserved their husbands and fathers and brothers back. They deserved answers. They deserved peace." But Cleary could not give them those things. He could only give them silence. And perhaps, in his judgment, silence was kinder than the alternative. The student asked, "Do you think he suffered for it?" Marsh said, "I know he did." The photograph of the 5 men was eventually identified and returned to the descendants. It now hangs in the Tuolumne County Historical Society in a small frame with a brass plaque that reads, Thomas Haverford, Samuel Pruitt, James Littleton, David Chen, and Martin Cleary, October 8, 1907, Hetch Hetchy expedition. Only one returned. Visitors sometimes ask the docent what happened to the others. The docent explains that 4 men died in the backcountry and that the 5th never said why. Some visitors ask if there are any theories. The docent says there are many theories but no answers. Some visitors ask if the survivor ever spoke. The docent says no, he never did. And then the visitors stand in front of the photograph and look at the 5 men, young and alive, standing in the morning light with no idea what is coming. And they wonder, as Dr. Marsh wondered, as the families wondered, as perhaps Cleary himself wondered in the long, silent years that followed. What does a man owe to the dead? And what does he owe to the living? And when those debts cannot both be paid, who decides which silence is worth keeping? Martin Cleary made his decision on October 14, 1907, somewhere in the Tuolumne River Canyon, in circumstances that will never be known. He kept it for 42 years. He took it with him when he died. And if there is an answer to what happened in those mountains, it lies where he left it, buried, silent, and alone.